A Viking settlement should have starved long before spring arrived. Picture Northern Europe 1,000 years ago. Weeks of cold rain, violent storms cutting trade routes apart, fishing becoming unpredictable, fields producing nothing during long dark months, no refrigerators, no electricity, no supermarkets, no emergency food shipments arriving from distant cities, just wooden settlements surrounded by forests, rivers, rocky coastlines, and cold ocean wind beneath endless gray skies. By every modern assumption, food should have spoiled constantly. Meat should have rotted within days. Milk should have turned dangerous. Fish should have become unusable almost immediately. And once winter arrived, entire communities should have collapsed into famine. But they did not consistently. In fact, Viking settlements survived some of the harshest environments in medieval Europe for centuries. Iceland, northern Norway, remote North Atlantic islands where farming barely worked and storms could isolate entire communities without warning. The question is not whether the Vikings suffered. They did. The real mystery is how they stored enough food to survive at all. And the answer had nothing to do with one invention. It was a system. Picture crowded Scandinavian shorelines during warm summer months, filled with movement and preparation. Workers hanging fish across enormous wooden drying racks beside salty ocean wind. Smoke drifting from preservation houses near muddy village roads. Barrels packed with fermented dairy products stored inside cool earth-covered structures. Families carrying grain into elevated wooden storage buildings before autumn rain arrives. Nothing stopped moving, because the Viking world treated food preservation as survival infrastructure. A failed harvest did not simply mean hunger, it could erase entire settlements. That pressure forced the Norse to develop preservation systems so effective that some methods still exist today, and many of them worked better than people realize. Start with fish. The ocean became one of the largest Viking food storage systems in Northern Europe, especially cod. Fresh fish spoils quickly. Anyone living near the sea understands that reality immediately. But the Norse discovered something extremely important long before modern refrigeration existed. Cold-moving air preserves protein remarkably well. Across Norway and Iceland, Viking communities dried massive quantities of fish outdoors using nothing more than temperature, salt air, and wind itself. The result was stockfish, hard as wood, lightweight, portable, capable of surviving for months or even years without rotting. And once production scaled across Viking trade routes, it changed survival completely. Picture summer coastlines beneath cold northern sunlight, where rows of cod hang above rocky beaches beside green hills and crashing ocean waves. Workers moving constantly between boats and drying racks. Children carrying fish inland through muddy village paths. Ships unloading fresh catches while salty wind moves through entire settlements filled with smoke, wood, and sea air. This was not random food storage. It was industrial survival. And fish was only one layer of the system. Meat preservation worked differently. Smoking became essential. Low controlled heat combined with airflow slowly removed moisture from meat, while smoke chemicals reduced bacterial growth at the same time. Again, the Vikings did not understand microbiology, but generations of observation taught them which methods kept food edible longer, and preserving food meant preserving survival itself. Now compare this to populations heavily dependent on fresh harvest cycles without large preservation flexibility. One failed season could become catastrophic quickly. The Viking world remained vulnerable too. Storms still destroyed supplies, fishing seasons still failed, cold still killed livestock. But preserved food extended survival windows dramatically. And extended survival windows give societies time to adapt before collapse becomes irreversible. Dairy preservation may have been even more important than meat. Fresh milk spoils rapidly, especially during warm weather. Modern refrigeration hides how dangerous dairy used to be for human survival. The Vikings solved this problem through fermentation. Milk transformed into skyr, cheese, butter, sour whey, and other preserved products capable of lasting far longer than fresh dairy ever could. And fermentation changed everything, because fermented foods do something remarkable. They create environments where harmful bacteria struggle to compete. Again, the Norse did not understand bacterial science, but they understood results. Fresh milk spoiled, fermented dairy survived. That observation, repeated generation after generation, eventually became cultural routine. Picture summer farms surrounded by green Scandinavian valleys where workers churn butter beside wooden buildings while smoke drifts upward from nearby preservation fires. Large barrels stored beneath cool turf-covered structures. Families separating curds from whey beside muddy farm roads, alive with livestock movement and constant labor. Nothing wasted. Even whey itself became useful. Historical evidence suggests some Viking communities stored meat inside acidic whey solutions, helping preservation during long winters. Modern people often imagine medieval food storage as crude desperation. The reality was far more intelligent. The Viking world repeatedly reused every possible resource because waste increased danger. And dangerous environments punish waste quickly. Grain storage also mattered enormously. Moisture destroys grain, rodents destroy grain, mold destroys grain. That forced Viking communities to elevate storage buildings above damp ground while protecting food supplies from weather and infestation as carefully as possible. Again and again, Viking survival depended on controlling moisture. Dry fish survives, dry grain survives, wet food dies. The Norse learned this lesson deeply, and entire settlement systems adapted around it long before scientific explanation existed. The Viking longhouse itself became part of the preservation system. Most people imagine these buildings only as places to sleep. They were much more than that. Longhouses controlled heat, airflow, smoke, storage, and communal labor simultaneously. Central fires dried interior air constantly. Roof vents allowed moisture and smoke to escape gradually. Hanging racks near controlled heat helped preserve food through slow-drying processes during difficult weather. The entire building functioned like a survival machine. Picture crowded wooden halls during rainy northern evenings where strips of meat hang near smoky rafters while workers repair fishing nets beside warm firelight. Children carrying preserved food into storage areas. Families organizing supplies before storms arrive. Barrels stacked carefully beside timber walls, insulated with turf against changing temperatures outside. Every space served multiple purposes. And perhaps most importantly, Viking communities stored food collectively. Large households reduced individual risk. If one family lost fishing equipment or livestock unexpectedly, wider networks inside settlements could sometimes absorb part of the damage temporarily. The Viking world survived through overlapping systems instead of isolated independence. That pattern appears constantly across Norse society. Trade supported preservation. Preservation supported travel. Travel supported trade. Everything reinforced everything else. Now compare this to societies heavily dependent on single annual harvests, vulnerable to drought, war, or transportation collapse. The Vikings remained vulnerable too, but they diversified survival constantly. Fish, meat, dairy, trade, grain, foraging, hunting. No single source carried the entire burden alone. That flexibility mattered enormously during unstable climates, where weather could destroy predictable agricultural patterns without warning. The Norse did not conquer nature. They adapted around its unpredictability, and adaptation often outperforms brute force over long periods of time. The Viking world was never food secure by modern standards. Famines still happened. Storms still destroyed supplies. Livestock still died during harsh seasons. This was not a perfect system. But compared to what survival should have looked like across the North Atlantic 1,000 years ago, the Norse performed remarkably well. And they did it without refrigeration, without modern chemistry, without industrial agriculture. That is what makes Viking food preservation so fascinating. The system worked because every layer supported every other layer simultaneously. Drying reduced spoilage, smoking reduced bacterial growth, fermentation extended dairy survival, trade redistributed shortages, longhouses controlled moisture, communal storage reduced individual collapse risk. No single technique explains Viking survival. The network explains it, and perhaps that reveals something deeper about the Viking world itself. The Norse rarely depended entirely on one fragile solution, not in shipbuilding, not in trade, not in survival. They built flexible systems capable of adapting when conditions change suddenly. That mindset helped Viking settlements survive environments many medieval societies would have struggled to endure for long. Beautiful Scandinavian coastlines filled with green hills, fishing villages, smokehouses, muddy roads, crowded harbors, rivers, livestock, and summer sunlight were not isolated primitive communities, barely surviving by luck. They were carefully adapted survival networks built through generations of observation and practical experience. The Vikings did not preserve food because they enjoyed preparation. They preserved food because nature gave them no choice. And over centuries, those repeated survival habits became something larger than technique. They became culture itself, a civilization learning again and again that the difference between survival and disaster often begins months before danger ever arrives.